Prisons are meant to be places of punishment, rehabilitation, and order. They are institutions designed to house criminals and ensure public safety. However, there are instances when the very places meant to enforce justice become the setting for unimaginable abuse, corruption, and suffering. One such prison stands out as a global scandal not just for its inhumane treatment of inmates, but for the way it exposed deep flaws in the justice system and human rights violations that shocked the world. The prison in question gained worldwide infamy due to its brutal treatment of detainees, many of whom were imprisoned without fair trials or solid evidence. Reports of extreme torture, overcrowding, starvation, and extrajudicial executions became known through leaked documents, whistleblower testimonies, and eventually, international investigations. The conditions inside were described as nothing short of medieval, with prisoners subjected to mental and physical torment that defied all human rights conventions. Among the most disturbing aspects of the scandal was the sheer number of people who were wrongfully imprisoned. Many of them had been locked away based on mere suspicions or political motivations rather than actual crimes. Some were thrown into cells for speaking out against their government, while others were targeted due to their ethnicity or religious beliefs. Families were torn apart and countless individuals disappeared into the system, never to be seen again. Torture chambers were said to exist within the prison, where inmates were interrogated using extreme methods, including beatings, electric shocks, and psychological manipulation. Survivors who managed to escape or were eventually released described nightmarish experiences, with many suffering from lifelong trauma. These accounts were further confirmed by leaked footage and testimony from former guards who could no longer bear the weight of their conscience. Despite international outrage, the prison continued to operate under a veil of secrecy. Governments and human rights organizations attempted to intervene, but the authorities running the facility denied all allegations, dismissing them as propaganda. Journalists who tried to investigate the matter were either arrested or silenced, further intensifying suspicions about the true extent of the horrors inside. Eventually, a major breakthrough came when a high-profile investigation led to the exposure of classified documents detailing the extent of the abuse. These reports revealed a systematic effort to cover up deaths, fabricate legal charges, and manipulate public perception. As the truth came to light, global protests erupted, with calls for justice echoing across nations. The prison, once hidden in the shadows, became a symbol of everything wrong with unchecked power and corruption. Even after its exposure, dismantling the institution proved to be a slow and complex process. Some of the officials responsible were put on trial, but many of them fled the country or used political connections to evade justice. The surviving victims demanded reparations, but their voices often went unheard. The scandal left a permanent scar on the history of justice systems worldwide, serving as a warning about the dangers of absolute authority with no oversight. This prison was not just a place of confinement, it was a place where humanity was tested and, for many, failed. It stood as a reminder that behind high walls and locked doors, the worst of atrocities could take place in the name of order and control. The scandal that unfolded forced people to question the very foundations of justice, revealing the darkness that can thrive when no one is watching. 40 additional paragraphs. The exposure of the prison's abuses did not happen overnight. For years, activists, former detainees, and journalists worked tirelessly to bring the truth to light, often risking their own lives in the process. Whistleblowers played a crucial role in unveiling the prison's atrocities, leaking sensitive documents and first-hand testimonies that painted a horrifying picture of what truly went on behind its walls. The level of corruption within the prison's administration was staggering, with officials taking bribes to release dangerous criminals while keeping innocent people locked away for political gain. One of the most disturbing revelations was the existence of secret underground cells, where prisoners were kept in total darkness for months, sometimes even years, as a form of psychological torture. The international community, though initially slow to react, eventually began imposing sanctions on the government responsible for the prison, but these efforts were often met with resistance from powerful allies. Survivors who managed to escape the prison described inhumane conditions, cells so overcrowded that prisoners had to sleep in shifts, floors covered in human waste, and infestations of rats and insects. Testimonies revealed that prison guards were not just enforcers of cruelty, but often participated in sadistic games, forcing prisoners to fight each other for their own amusement. The prison's medical facilities were virtually non-existent, and those who fell ill were left to die without any treatment, their bodies often dumped in mass graves. Children were among the victims of this brutal system, with some being born within the prison walls and never knowing a life beyond the barbed wire. When investigators finally entered the facility after its exposure, they were met with an overwhelming stench of death, confirming reports that bodies had been left to rot in hidden corners of the prison. The scandal prompted global human rights organizations to re-evaluate their methods, realizing that such horrors could persist undetected for years despite their watchful presence. Some of the high-ranking officials who once ran the prison later claimed they were merely following orders, attempting to shift the blame onto their superiors. Documentaries, books, and investigative reports about the prison helped keep its story alive, ensuring that the world would not forget the suffering that took place there. Efforts to bring justice to the victims were complicated by bureaucratic red tape, with many former detainees waiting years for any form of compensation or recognition. Many of the guards who participated in the torture and killings blended back into society, never facing any consequences for their actions. The prison's architecture itself was designed to be a fortress, making escape nearly impossible, which is why so few survivors ever managed to tell their stories. The psychological impact on those who lived through the ordeal was severe, with many experiencing PTSD, night terrors, and an inability to reintegrate into normal life. The prison's downfall was ultimately triggered by a combination of international pressure, internal whistleblowing, and the courage of survivors willing to speak out. Political regimes often use prisons as tools of control, turning them into places where dissenters are silenced rather than rehabilitated. Despite its closure, similar prisons still exist in other parts of the world, operating under the radar with the same brutality. In the aftermath, some former prisoners formed advocacy groups to fight against wrongful imprisonment and government oppression. The media played a vital role in spreading awareness, but many news outlets faced censorship and legal threats for reporting on the scandal. The sheer number of missing persons linked to the prison remains unknown, as many were never officially documented upon entry. Some of the torture techniques used in the prison were traced back to intelligence agencies, revealing a disturbing level of collaboration. The scandal shook faith in the justice system, making people question whether similar abuses were happening in their own countries. Efforts to rebuild the legal system after the prison's exposure were met with resistance from those who had profited from corruption. The prison's funding was traced back to both state and private sources, showing how deep the web of corruption went. Even though the world learned of the prison's horrors, many of those responsible continued to live freely, shielded by political protections. Survivors still carry physical scars from their time inside, with some suffering permanent injuries from beatings and torture. Attempts to repurpose the prison building failed, as its horrifying history made it impossible to erase its dark past. Investigations found that some prisoners had been used for medical experiments without their consent, adding another layer of horror to the scandal. The fear of being sent to such a place kept entire populations under control, as the government used the prison as a symbol of ultimate punishment. The prison's staff often recruited criminals to act as enforcers, giving them unchecked power over fellow inmates. The prison's closure did not erase its legacy, as its name remains synonymous with human rights violations. Governments around the world continue to grapple with the ethical implications of allowing such places to exist in the first place. Some of the victims' families still search for answers, hoping to uncover the fates of their missing loved ones. The scandal highlighted the dangers of absolute power, proving that without oversight, prisons can become tools of tyranny. Despite efforts to move forward, the ghosts of the prison still haunt those who lived through its horrors. The world may have moved on, but the lessons from this global scandal should never be forgotten. Injustice, when left unchecked, can turn prisons into nightmares. This story is a reminder that vigilance is the only defense against history repeating itself. The long-term effects of the prison scandal reached beyond just those who were incarcerated. Families of the victims suffered immense emotional trauma, many never receiving closure as their loved ones vanished without explanation. Some spent years searching for answers, only to be met with silence or fabricated records that obscured the truth. Some of the prison guards, despite their involvement in the abuse, also became victims of the system. Many were forced into their roles under threats of violence, while others were subjected to the same harsh conditions if they failed to comply with orders. This created a cycle of fear and oppression that corrupted everyone within the prison's walls. Attempts to bring justice to the prison's victims often fell short due to political interference. Many governments were reluctant to acknowledge their own complicity, leading to legal loopholes that protected those responsible. Even international courts struggled to prosecute key figures, as extradition and diplomatic negotiations became roadblocks. As survivors began to share their testimonies, disturbing patterns emerged. Many reported similar methods of psychological torture, including forced confessions, prolonged isolation, and sleep deprivation. The psychological scars left on these individuals lasted far beyond their time in captivity. Some of the techniques used in the prison were later revealed to have been inspired by historical torture methods dating back centuries. This showed how certain forms of cruelty continued to persist throughout human history, simply evolving to fit modern institutions. The prison's exposure sparked widespread debates on the ethical responsibilities of governments regarding incarceration. Some argued that the facility represented a necessary evil in the fight against crime, while others insisted it was a blatant violation of human rights that could never be justified. Investigations uncovered financial corruption that allowed the prison to operate unchecked for years. It was revealed that officials were embezzling funds meant for prison maintenance, leading to deteriorating conditions, lack of food, and extreme overcrowding. When pressure from international organizations forced some reforms, the changes were often superficial. New policies were announced, but behind closed doors, the same abuses continued under different names. Guards were retrained, but the culture of brutality remained deeply ingrained. Some of the officials who were forced to resign over the scandal quietly relocated and resumed similar positions in other countries. This lack of accountability further fueled public outrage, as many saw it as proof that those in power could escape justice whenever it suited them. Even after the prison was formally shut down, many of its former detainees lived in constant fear. They were branded as criminals, making it difficult for them to reintegrate into society. Job opportunities were scarce, and many struggled with the stigma of having been imprisoned for crimes they never committed. The physical evidence of the prison's brutality, such as blood-stained walls, underground torture chambers, and mass graves, became the focus of forensic investigations. Scientists and human rights experts worked tirelessly to document the horrors that had taken place, ensuring the world could never deny what had occurred. Some former prisoners who attempted to sue the government for their wrongful imprisonment faced intimidation tactics. They received threats, were followed by unknown individuals, and in some cases even disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The psychological conditioning used within the prison was so severe that some prisoners developed loyalty to their captors. This phenomenon, often compared to Stockholm Syndrome, made it difficult for certain individuals to reintegrate into society after their release. Historians drew comparisons between this prison and past human rights abuses, noting chilling similarities to concentration camps, secret police detention centers, and wartime internment facilities. The parallels raised uncomfortable questions about how societies allow such atrocities to happen again and again. Attempts to demolish the prison and erase its dark history were met with resistance from human rights activists. They argued that the site should be preserved as a historical reminder of what had happened, ensuring future generations would learn from its horrors. Some countries that had initially condemned the prison later softened their stance, forming diplomatic ties with the very government that had allowed such atrocities. This exposed the hypocrisy of international politics, where human rights violations were sometimes overlooked for economic or strategic gain. One of the most haunting aspects of the prison's history was the discovery of detailed records kept by its administrators. These files contained meticulous logs of every prisoner, their interrogations, and their fates. The cold, bureaucratic nature of these documents made the atrocities even more chilling. Some guards who defected and testified against the prison's administration later found themselves living in fear. They knew too much, and their knowledge made them targets. Many were forced to live under new identities or seek asylum in foreign countries. The prison's architecture itself was designed to dehumanize inmates. Narrow, windowless corridors, steel-barred ceilings, and isolation cells without beds were all intended to strip prisoners of any sense of dignity or hope. The exposure of the prison's atrocities led to a surge in activism, with younger generations mobilizing to prevent similar abuses in the future. Protests, awareness campaigns, and educational programs emerged to ensure that history would not repeat itself. Some of the surviving prisoners struggled with extreme paranoia after their release. They avoided public places, distrusted authority figures, and found it impossible to sleep without nightmares of their time inside. The prison became a case study for criminologists and psychologists who analyzed the ways in which absolute power can corrupt individuals. The brutal transformation of ordinary people into torturers highlighted the dark potential within human nature. The scandal reignited debates about prison reform worldwide. Many argued that prisons should focus more on rehabilitation rather than punishment to prevent abuses like those that occurred in this facility. The final days of the prison were chaotic. As international pressure mounted, some officials ordered the destruction of evidence. Documents were burned, bodies were hastily buried, and surveillance footage was erased in a desperate attempt to cover up the truth. Despite the horror, there were stories of resilience. Some prisoners formed secret alliances, helping each other survive through hidden messages, smuggled food, and whispered words of encouragement. Artists and writers used the scandal as inspiration for films, books, and music, ensuring that the prison's story reached audiences beyond traditional news media. One of the most shocking revelations was that some prisoners had been used as test subjects for experimental drugs and medical procedures, raising ethical concerns about the abuse of scientific research. The prison's economy was built on forced labor, with inmates being made to produce goods for corporations that had no idea or chose to ignore where their products were coming from. Several high-ranking officials involved in the prison's operations were later found to have amassed enormous personal wealth, proving that for some, the suffering of others was simply a business. Some former prisoners later turned to crime, having been so deeply traumatized by their experiences that they found reintegration impossible. The cycle of violence continued beyond the prison's walls. The prison's closure did not mean the end of human rights abuses in the country. New prisons were built, and though they were less notorious, reports of similar mistreatment continued to emerge. Some former detainees devoted their lives to exposing other hidden prisons, using their own suffering as a driving force to seek justice for others. The scandal forced the global community to reconsider the definition of justice, as many began to question whether punishment-based systems were sustainable. Families of missing prisoners continued to gather at the prison site, hoping for information about their loved ones, even years after its closure. A museum was eventually created on the site, filled with photographs, personal letters, and remnants from the prison, ensuring its victims would not be forgotten. The prison's warden, once seen as an untouchable figure of power, eventually faced trial, but his punishment was seen as too lenient by those who had suffered under his rule. The scandal became a rallying cry for justice reform worldwide, pushing nations to rethink their incarceration policies and human rights protections. Even decades later, survivors and activists continue to fight to keep the prison's story alive, ensuring that its horrors remain a warning for future generations. The story of the prison became a symbol of resistance, showing that no institution, no matter how powerful, could remain hidden forever. In the end, the prison's legacy was not just one of suffering but also of resilience, the resilience of those who survived, those who spoke out, and those who fought for justice in the face of overwhelming darkness.